Well, it is really quite a distinct pleasure to be able to introduce Rodrigo Pérez de Arce tonight as the keynote speaker. It is not an easy task to actually find a keynote speaker that could actually sort of, in a way, address and synthesize such a broad set of issues that are being sort of put on the table in such an open way, like we've been doing today. And I think we're quite honored to be able to have found, I think, somebody that can, in many ways, instigate and follow a very lucid aesthetic argument all the way from the scale of architecture to the scale of territory, to be able to tie, I think, a lot of the ideas and concepts that we're seeing today within the disciplines of architecture and design. And I think we're quite honored to be able to have Rodrigo Pérez de Arce to here sort of to, in a way, fulfill that role. Rodrigo Pérez de Arce is an architect from the Universidad Católica de Chile and holds an AA graduate diploma from the Architectural Association. He has taught both in the Architectural Association and in the School of Architecture of the Universidad Católica de Chile, and he has been a visiting professor in Universidad Central de Venezuela, University of Arizona, University of Pennsylvania, Cornell, University of Bath, and University of Delhi Studi in Rome. He has lectured widely and written several articles in international journals and published a large number of books, of which Domicilio Urbano, which looks at a variety of urban typologies from modernity within the Latin American city, is my very favorite. He is currently refurbishing in his private practice a public market in Valparaiso, World Heritage Site, and is researching the subject of play as a generator of architectural and urban form. I am very pleased and very honored to welcome such a man of synthesis as Rodrigo Pérez de Arce. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes? Well, thank you very much, Felipe, Ana Maria, Victor, and everyone who's been involved in inviting me and organizing this event. I look at my position as a keynote speaker with some trepidation. I hope to be able to be to the level of the previous speakers. I like to frame my presentation around the subject of landscape. The reason why the title talks about landscape is that I see landscape as a kind of generous framework, something which is choral, which is polyphonic, which does not admit one single author, which is accumulative and which is quite inclusive. And why do we talk about landscape by design and landscape by default is simply to make a kind of a polar distinction, which in reality is probably not so clear, between something which is thought out as an idea, a design, as something which is purposefully shaped, let's say, and default as something which is somehow occurring by omission, by accident. South America, landscape by default, landscapes by design. Unlike the North American conquest of the West that eventually led onto the establishment of a continental web of interoceanic highways, no such common drive occurred in South America. Nevertheless, conceived around 1923, a hesitant Pan-American highway that comprised various termini and a bunch of paths through the USA established a north-south continental axis. Since 1930, Pan Am Air also fostered this literal and conceptual interstate link, further stimulating a Pan-American imagination. The IIRSA program intends to irrigate the vast and thinly occupied South American hinterland with state-of-the-art interoceanic corridors, binding Pacific, Atlantic, and Caribbean shores, and linking disconnected districts by means of land routes, waterways, and their allied infrastructures. A shift of access from the Pan-American to the interoceanic consummates a process of territorial colonization whilst equally reflecting the east-west linkages that characterize our current world order, and the continental preeminence of Brazil, which we have seen already in the previous presentations. The IIRSA transport termini will now coincide with major harbors. Traditionally, linked to a scopic command of a particular horizon, the term landscape evokes a determined scale range. Responding instead to geopolitical considerations, the scale of continental infrastructures vastly exceeds any such static command. Nevertheless, throughout the 20th century, certain architects and artists have attempted to address simultaneously diverse scales, such as that of the local in relation to the global, sites in relation to networks, places in relation to systems, metropolitan sites in relation to hinterlands. Other than Le Corbusier, some noteworthy sponsors of these ideas are the artificers of Brasilia, the Valparaiso School Group, and artists such as Torres Garcia, whose agendas have also led on to the recasting of cartographic conventions. South American landscape by default, landscapes by design, will attempt to describe such visions in parallel to de facto territorial transformations induced by economic and political agendas. First of all, then, a word about the point of departure of my presentation is to do with the work of architects, and the question that introduces the presentation is why do architects concern themselves with the scale of geography or geopolitics, and how has it happened in the recent past that there is a kind of segment, let's say, of modernity whereby architects have looked at these scales that vastly exceed their scale of operation and command. While I was preparing the presentation, a few days ago, we get these press reports about these continental corridors that cross this national park in Bolivia. The press report which we receive in Chile is, looks like a listing of, let's say, natural species, natural conditions, and birds and plants that might be endangered by such operation. The poster introduces the highway, which the corridor, the path, the road, which is the kind of primary subject of the IIRSA project as a menace. And the relationship that it depicts is between nature, the menace to nature, nature endangered, and some kind of an idea of progress which is already not acceptable to the local communities. Bolivian President Morales announced a temporary ban on the highway scheme. The scheme was, according to press reports, financed by the Brazilian government with long-term and very favorable loans. So we don't know exactly what is going to happen to this. So that there is a first point which I think is not the main topic of my presentation, but I think has to be bear in mind, which is to do with the notion of the largest possible public investments that are being implemented now as something which has to be designed in such a way that it reaches down to the people and that is seen as an equitable proposition. There is an ethical question involved, which I think is a primary question. We're talking about metaphor and imagination in the previous presentations, particularly in the words of Graciela Silvestri. The power of words. The idea of the roads. In Chile recently, the recent forms of unrest that we have had in Santiago have resulted in, for the first time in about 20 years, in the crowds of people taking over the main streets. And the kind of possession of the streets as a political weapon is something is highly symbolical, is also highly effective. It means stopping somehow traffic and making somehow visible the ownership of the public space, of the public arena, of the public domain. The same happens, of course, with these practices, which are probably more recurrent, of the piqueteros in Argentina. So there is a political dimension, and there is a dimension of scale. There is a kind of epistemological dimension in terms of the realm of a discipline and the scale realm of that discipline. And there's a political dimension which is also related in a way to scale and to questions of power. Who is in command of such projects? A few years ago, we did a study for a region which is close to Santiago, and like these vast territories of the plains in Brazil or Paraguay or Argentina, Chile is a country of very small valleys. The amount of agricultural land in Chile is closer perhaps to the area of Belgium or a small-size European country than to any other kind of American equivalent. This is a small valley. We can see here a pattern of occupation, which is all based on irrigation, artificial irrigation, dates back to the Inca period. This is the first form of agricultural occupation in the valley here. And the pattern we see here is, in a way, a portrait of a pre-Hispanic kind of form of occupation. And then there is a second wave, which is much more capital intensive, and which is something which develops as from the 19th century, which generates these large kind of land holdings. Then we have a river, which is more like a torrent. It's never, rivers go down from the Andes very kind of violently onto the sea on a short stretch. The larger kind of picture of the area looks like this. We have these towns, San Felipe, Los Andes, and then a series of small townships. There is a distance between them of no more than 20 kilometers. So this is a place you can, for example, you could cycle easily from one to the other. There are lots of island hills here. There's a kind of alluvial plain. And then we have this formation of hills all over the place. The river runs through this area here and goes down onto the sea. The reason I'm showing this area is because this is one of the current places where the implementation of the international corridor is taking place. Our analysis, we were asked to do a kind of landscape analysis of the area, and we became very interested in this kind of formation, this kind of system of bays or inlets, where you find a certain pattern of agriculture reaching to a certain height. You find a stream of water, which results also on an axis of penetration. And in a way, the edge of the valley is surrounded by these kind of concave spaces on a kind of a fractal system which reproduces itself at every scale, also onto minute scales. Here we have the two Spanish foundations on a grid. The whole agricultural system is based on artificial irrigation, so that canals are issued from the main river, the Aconcagua River, which runs this way out onto the west. And the whole system of occupation is gravitational, which means to say that water issues out of the river, is captured at a high level, and is conducted in order to irrigate the valley. Now, this is then the setting for the construction of the highway. And the two theses about the construction of the highway were to do with, one was to do with placing it on the river bed, which is wide. The other one was to do with placing it on the middle of the valley. And you can imagine that both approaches had disastrous effects on the structure of life within that space. If we look at the road connections, if we make abstraction of the topography, what we see is a void which registers here, which represents the river, and we see a series of roads that end up, or pathways that end up at that point. And here we're confronted with a paradox because the more primitive, inverted commas, modes of connection actually bypass the river quite easily for most of the time of the year, whereas the road connection, the motorized road connection, let's say, has to find a proper bridge. So if, in terms of connectivity, this is closer to, although a very basic system, but it's closer to a modern idea of connectivity, and this is closer maybe to a very primitive way of connectivity. But once you draw the highway through the valley, you will destroy every other alternative which is not conceived within this kind of mode. And if we talk about equity, what we could call collateral damage in terms of, in this case, in terms of breaking up a network of connections for humans, also maybe for animals, between one shore and the other, is something that would have to be contemplated. And that kind of more integrative vision of infrastructure is probably within the mission of the architect. If we look at, of course, we have this kind of division of labor. It is engineers who would design the roads. These are the kinds of plans that they're going to produce, and their concerns are going to be mainly, if not solely, confined to technical questions of efficiency. So we have two visions which are somehow colliding. There's a powerful one, which is this one, and which talks in easy terms also with large planning departments or maybe large corporations and financing bodies. And there is another view which is kind of bottom-up, which is fragile, which has no kind of political voice, but which is quite essential for the, eventually for the development, let's say healthy development of an area like that. We're talking about words. We talk about impact and mitigation. I don't know when this kind of polar concept was introduced in our kind of agendas, but it has become a common kind of framework for the discussion of any project. The project is equated with impact in the sense that the project is seen as a kind of agent of violence within the landscape. And mitigation in this case is, of course, some piece of so-called artwork which is financed by the government through some kind of maybe sponsored scheme or whatever, and that would somehow repair the damage done by the project. I think that the idea of thinking of a project in terms of impact is I find it kind of misguided idea. It takes away from the project all that project could have in terms of the potential to create a new reality. It makes it into an inevitable form of damage inflicted upon a place. And mitigation comes afterwards, many times in the form of art, work, sometimes in the form of landscape, in order to repair something which is done, which is some damage which is done irreversible to a place. There is an article by the editor of Suma magazine, Diaz, where he explains how does it work for a local inhabitant of the periphery in Buenos Aires if he wants to somehow connect with the city. How does it work within the scheme of these kind of large-scale corridors? And of course, you can't. If you have to drive quite a long way until you can connect to the system, or if you want to go to the other side. The scale of the place is completely changed, and the lateral connections and the kind of notion of a network that somehow progressively intensify the connections within a given place is completely destroyed by the emergence of the highway. But to go back to the first question, why is it that architects, and what do they do, architects, when they look at these very, very large scales? I like to look at the continental frameworks, and I think we have to look at the issue of representation, and also the conventions of representation. Here we have a Chilean architect that he's trying to elaborate an argument about town in the south part of Chile, the southern cone, and he's simply trying to illustrate the amount of water that we have within this area of the world relative to the amount of water and land you find in the northern hemisphere. This must obviously account for something. It has some kind of repercussion in our culture, in our potential as a country, in our way of living, and so on. Here we have Maurice Rotival, this urbanist who is looking at the plan of Caracas, and he's equally trying to find this kind of analog between a sea which is kind of bounded and creates a system of proximities like the Caribbean Sea with the Mediterranean Sea. So his situation is completely opposite to our situation. But again, the map becomes like a device to try to understand the condition of a place like Venezuela in relation to its environment, its natural environments. We also have this kind of utopia, and I think this is quite relevant in relation to the IIRSA initiative, although the Oxíades did not clearly envision direct routes issuing from one coast to the other, but the notion that it is the roads rather than the town that becomes like a predominant, even at the scale of the continent, is quite clearly depicted in his representation. More recently, Jared Diamond, when he discusses the development of Europe and Asia, I suppose when he asked himself the question, why was it not that the Incas conquered Spain rather than the Spaniards conquered Peru? Why was it that what was it that the Europeans had that the locals in America didn't, that made the progression of this conquest so fast? He talks about the tilted axis, and he makes the point about the extreme kind of ecological differences and climatic differences that one finds within this axis as compared to the relative ecological and climatic kind of conditions of equivalence that one finds within Eurasia. And that means that in his terms, for example, to export a crop from France to some parts of Asia would be easier in terms of acclimatizing than to try to do the same from northern Canada to southern Argentina. And this would have had results in terms of historical development. The land has been submitted to different kind of processes of rationalization. The early kind of Spanish vision of the continent, once they established this line of division with Portuguese empire, is described in this way, and it follows a series of parallels. And it goes from coast to coast, and in a sense, it ignores, of course, the topographical accidents, the formidable topographical accidents that you find within this region. It is a conceptualization, but it is quite interesting that it becomes so different to the actual reality of the countries. A point which the architects from the Valparaiso school pointed at some moment, which seems to me very relevant, was that the geographical division was somehow implemented or envisaged or imagined in terms of a system of parallel lines, and the territorial division of cities was also implemented within a system which was orthogonal. There was some kind of correlation between the larger scale and the smaller scale. And although this is not comparable maybe to the Jeffersonian grids, nevertheless, there was something about orthogonality that became quite important during the period of the Spanish colonization of South America. So that we say that this is a topographical accident. Of course, that's a kind of a metaphor. There are no natural accidents, this nature. But it is clear why this can be seen as a topographical accident. This is Santiago, Chile, and that is the Santa Lucia Hill. If we look further into the issue of representation and the conception of the continents or the continental relationships, we also find this type of situation. The case of Chile is quite extreme. Of course, probably my Argentinian friends would say that this was different at the time, that the definition of what could have been the area corresponding to the Chilean, the Reino de Chile could have been different, but the point is that the kind of configuration of the country only consolidates by the late 19th century. One could say ultimately by the 20th century, so it's very recent, and also through devastating wars against Bolivia and Peru. So that what we now find as a kind of jigsaw puzzle of pieces that kind of comfortably fit together a really mapping of a series of conflicts and complex processes of colonization and border definition that have resulted on this kind of configuration. In our case, our south is like the American West. And like the Argentinians, also had a war, I understand, which they call the War of the Desert, I believe, which was against the Indians. So it was the case in Chile. If you look at pictures of what was going on here by the 1880s, it looks exactly like a Western movie picture. One could imagine the Inca trails that covered much of this area of the continent, and likewise, there were probably a series of other more informal trails that somehow crisscross these lands. But in modern terms, the railway makes something which is probably the closest to the idea of continental connections. This is 1914. Many of the lines which are depicted here are planned and not implemented necessarily, but the network is quite impressive, but it's mostly conceived in national terms. One outstanding kind of international connection is the Transcontinental Railway that brings together Valparaiso and Buenos Aires, which is implemented in 1910, crossing the Andes at high altitude and with a very interesting layout. Of course, there was this fantastic evolution in terms of railways throughout Latin America. And the kind of connectivity that we might have had by 1910, it took a long time in terms of Chilean road systems to recover the standards and the times of connectivity between distant places that we had at the beginning of the century. The Pan American Highway is part of my youth, it's part of the mythology of that period. It was the first road that was really paved and built to a high standard. It was like a standard of road making at the time. And of course, there's a dispute as to whether it finishes here, or Argentinians would say that it finished here. But so there is also some dispute as to what happens to the north. But the interesting point is that it's Pan-American. It integrates north and south. It consolidates a line of dependence in terms of political dependence, also economical dependence, but it also in some ways it reconstitutes the primeval line of occupation of the continent, which issued from Alaska to the south. Panam, of course, Panam was transcontinental. So in a sense, it was not kind of exclusive to the relationship between North America and South America. But the name Panam also rings a bell. And again, it reinforces this idea of a Pan-American idea, Pan-American connection. And this probably has to be seen also in terms of the Cold War and certain kind of developments of the period. And these are airlines in Latin America by 1942. I think if we looked at this is a picture where there's little kind of flight autonomy for the aircraft. Therefore, there are lots of stoppages on the way. But a more modern picture would probably show that from each capital, we have lots of connections to the north, and we have rather poor connections within our own continent. Certainly very expensive ones. And here we are with the IIRSA plans. But one way of conceptualizing the continent is in terms of plans, of maps. The other way of conceptualizing it is in terms of sections. And this is, of course, Alexander von Humboldt. And he is talking about what happens in terms of natural formations, natural conditions, ecological conditions, and so on, as you climb up and down across the Andes. And here we have Le Corbusier, very uncharitable to Chile. He reduces us to vertical plane. He's more kind of friendly to Argentinians, and he expands the city onto the ocean with a beautiful airport by the river. And here we have Amancio Williams that makes a different kind of portrait. Amancio Williams is concerned about the relationship between the horizontal kind of vastness of the Pampas and the horizontal vastness of the river, and this kind of quite hierarchical organization of the city. which is, I presume, very true to reality. It's to say that the city grows higher and denser as it gets closer to the harbor, which is also the point of origin. So we were saying that the landscape is a choral work. It's not something which could be attributed to an author, and I think that is quite an interesting and valid kind of proposition. And the issue, of course, would be how to be able to talk to others in a language which was fully understood, such as to attain the kind of response in terms of the infrastructural project that makes justice to the density, let's say, of the problem in hand. The projects by Le Corbusier in Latin America, or his sketches by, in Latin America, I think are obviously a kind of a landmark. Here we have Peter Blake denouncing the kind of chaos created in North America by rapid transit systems. And here we have Le Corbusier with the famous sketches for Rio de Janeiro, which of course paid not that much attention to question of traffic. They're more involved with an idea of somehow relationship between the idea of speed, a kind of highlighted idea of speed, an experience of the landscape, the acceleration of velocity at high speed above the city, but also an idea that infrastructure is not something isolated from the city, but that it becomes itself part of the cities inhabited. This is less known than that, but it is a similar proposition. He talks about the viaducts, the Roman viaducts as a model, and he summons the landscape architects to take care of these kinds of situations. He says, landscape architects ought not to forget that rural roads are a long vestibule to the peasant's home. He's talking about the French roads. We should compose the pastoral symphony of French highways with vegetation and space. Of course, the roads, the highway, are an embodiment of some idea of modernity, and I think the topic has sufficiently been discussed, but it is quite dominant, it's quite strong, and in a sense is still with us. The conceptualization of the four routes is also a way of taking care of the relationships across the territory to a large scale. It also exceeds, in a way, the scope of the architect's kind of domain or work. The kind of prime sites assigned to the aircraft and to the landing strips and the airports acquire this fantastic kind of symbolic form, so that you reach out onto the sea and then you elevate and you leave the land at a very kind of special place, like an aircraft carrier. But also we can see in Le Corbusier lots of speculations about the structural organization of pathways and routes, whether waterways or roads in Europe. Somehow the answer for this must be, at some level, teleological. It's more concerned with some kind of a destiny, an idea of ultimate destiny. The understanding of the very, very large scale gets us closer, perhaps, to understand the destiny of a place like France as a crossroads, for example, or some other country as the end point of a system of communications that covers the earth. But there are also certain remarks which I think are very kind of crucial to our discussion, like this one, for example. This is is a post-war, post-First World War conceptualization of a system of subterranean kind of refuges for air raid shelters, which could also work as a kind of a ring road around Paris, and this is Haussmann. And the message Le Corbusier is trying to convey is that somehow to bury an investment of this kind, to literally bury it underground, yields no benefits whatsoever to the creation of new spaces or the regeneration of Paris, whereas here, the investment, an equal investment, was made in such a way that somehow recasts the city and sets it for a new life for the next century. There is again, this is like a real investment in the sense that from then on, Paris would somehow acquire benefits, accrue benefits out of this operation, whereas this becomes somehow limited to a level of infrastructure without any capacity to engender new urban conditions. If we look at Santiago, Chile, in the recent decades, Santiago, Chile has been the site of construction of highways, and our main highway is precisely being built under the river, actually. So that the largest public investment which has been made in Santiago over decades has resulted in the creation of a corridor which has brought no kind of improvement to the citizen at street level whatsoever. On the contrary, has tended to create these kinds of situations. We were talking about imagination and metaphor. I think it is quite pertinent to show the image of Torres Garcia when he turns the continents upside down, and he asks himself, why should we use the north, the northerners' north, in a way, as our reference? Why should we look at things the way Europeans and North Americans look at things? And the question is interesting because it is a convention to place maps one way or the other, in the same way that it's a convention to place architectural plans one direction or the other. It used to be so that the architectural plan of a house was always oriented so that the entrance was down and the way through the house was upwards, until someone discovered the idea of somehow organizing architectural plans so that north was always placed upwards. It simply brings another level of convention. But at this point, I have to talk about the Valparaiso School. As you realize, my presentation is very much based on a certain vision of Latin America, which is being kind of elaborated from Chile. We could talk about the South Americas, as many South Americas as there are South Americans, because there are really very different visions. And in a way, the way we look at the place is also very kind of dependent on our viewpoints. The Valparaiso School emerged as a very small institution, which was somehow created out of our school in Santiago. Valparaiso is about 120 kilometers away. A group of tutors moved out of our school in order to experiment with what they saw as a more relevant, a more modern way of looking at things. And Valparaiso provided a good kind of emplacement for that. It was a harbor town, was quite interesting as a setting itself, and it had sufficient vitality from the cultural point of view to sustain an interesting school. The there were many propositions for the creation of this school. One of them was the integration. The prime kind of idea was to integrate artists, and particularly poets. There was Godofredo Yomi, a Buenos Aires poet, who was a kind of a co-director together with Alberto Cruz, the architect. There was a permanent conversation between the architect and the poet. The experimental line of the school at some points is closer maybe to some of the experiences of situationism and the reef than it is to the experience of any other canonical kind of modern school of the time. They trust the value of words. They are interested in the business of naming. They examine the ways in which the continent was named, and they look at the chronicles, and they look at the way and at the period when the conquerors had to somehow place a name or name something, be it so that they invent a name or that they recast a name like Santiago, for example, which appears some 300 times over South America, or be it that they take up an Indian name, which they probably mispronounced, but somehow they fix as a way of identifying a place. They propose that why should we not stand on our own feet and look at the world as if we were in the center of the world. This does not mean to acknowledge the importance of Europe in particular, but simply to say that we shouldn't look at this place only from the standpoint of the things that it lacks. We should look at it as in terms of its own fullness. So they take the convention of the inverted map also as a way of asserting some kind of emancipation from a standard kind of way of reading things, as a way of exploring perhaps the potential of the southern areas in particular, and they set themselves to produce a series of plans. This one is related to cities, this one is related to waterways. We can see the extreme kind of extensive waterway systems on the eastern border that we've seen in the previous presentations, and extremely short waterway systems on the Pacific side, and this is a system of mountains. One would have to go a long way in order to explain things which would appear much more esoteric, like, for example, this is the casting of the Southern Cross over the southern continent, and this is a figure of the seabed. There are questions about the Pacific Ocean. They were very far-sighted at the time. We have to imagine that this is occurring around the mid-50s. We're in the middle of the Cold War, and they say that they're talking about the alienation of these countries from the Pacific Ocean, the way in which the Andes kind of interrupt any connections between the countries, and the fact that the ocean is somehow in the hands of the great powers. They produce a series of representations, always trying to subvert the standard kind of viewpoints, and intending to illustrate the condition of the continent. If you place the Pacific Ocean in the middle as the greater body of water that one finds in the globe, then your understanding of the coast of California and Chile is quite different, as it's somehow the whole system of relations becomes reconfigured. They draw the Pacific bed. At some point, one asks oneself why, what is the purpose of all this kind of research? It has got no direct purpose, but I think it helps to bring out some kind of consciousness about the nature of the place in its larger scale. They do also some kind of prospection in terms of the historical roots of so-called discovery, the way in which Colón, for example, explores the northern areas, and the way in which Magellan, for the first time, circumvents the Tierra del Fuego and the southern places. Expeditions, connections, Pacific journeys. This is a contemporary plan, for example, of the density of sea connections between Chile and other countries, and the way in which the traffic goes by the coast mostly. Pascua is a Chilean possession, but it doesn't attract much movement, and there is nothing ongoing onto the other side. And they borrow the terms the interior ocean. This is a metaphor which comes out of one of the chronicles, of the Spanish chronicles. The interior ocean stands for the so-called empty vastness of the continents, Amazonia, the Pampas, and so on. So their view is that there is a kind of sparsely populated area here, and there is this vast emptiness on the other side. In terms of Chile, the country stands in between two immense empty territories. And there is a model which I think it is also the model of the IIRSA plan, which is North America, where the pattern of conquest goes from east to west. And somehow the American colonization consummates when the country reaches on the western shores, whereas in the South American case, we have no such pattern occurring. And this would also explain, it would account for the power and importance of this country within the 20th century, as opposed to the relative kind of marginality of South America during the same period. They draw this interior ocean. They depict these are, for example, the flights from city to city. There are kind of transport routes and air routes and so on depicted. And they try to highlight this condition of occupation and colonization by the shores. They look also at some kind of political conditions or power conditions, such as the dominance, let's say, of the space of the sea by the great powers. Chile is part of the there is a part of a pact, a defense pact within the United States, together with all the countries on the Pacific shore. The others would be protectorates or American possessions. The group undertakes a trip which works a little bit like a derive, and which wants to describe a journey from Cape Horn to Santa Cruz de la Sierra in Bolivia. Santa Cruz de la Sierra coincides with the point of crossing of the southern cross of the continent. That might be the metaphysical kind of reading, but a more kind of common reading of Santa Cruz de la Sierra, or more common significance of the place, would be associated to the fact that it is an area that seems to bring together or to act as a hinge point between the great kind of geographic events, the Andes, the Amazonian forest, the Pampas. 1965, they start on this journey. There are a bunch of architects and poets. There's an English poet, there's a French philosopher, there are a couple of, there is an Argentinian sculpture, and there are 3 or 4 Chilean architects that start this journey from Cape Horn to the north. As they move along their journey, and that's why I say this is like the reef in a way, they will stop at some point. They will improvise a sculpture. In this case, we have Alberto Cruz drawing up a description of the voyage over the wall of a local school. They would declaim poetry. They are in for kind of oral poetry and collective poetry, not for lyrical poetry. And this would be typical of their, in a sense, is much like 19th century explorers. This would be an Alberto Cruz notebook. He would have hundreds of these notebooks. And throughout the trip, there are observations about different kinds of situations, which covers quite a wide spectrum of issues, including many that we consider nowadays as belonging to the realm of ecology. So it's not only restricted to questions of urban layout and so on. They describe their adventure this way. They're writing a poem, which is a collective work. The poem is called Amereida. Amereida is the name of a poem that follows from Virgilius' Aeneid. At once a manifesto and a compilation. It sets certain goals, it talks about a mission and collects thoughts. It was created by a mixed group of architects, philosophers, artists, and poets of diverse provenances, and who set themselves to explore the southern cone. The trip was kind of framed between the southernmost reach and the hearts of the continent. Posited as an epic about South America, the text ponders the significance of such genre. They say so, inverted commas, the epic frame, so different to the elegiac lyrical one, retains everything, including a vast historic panorama, but it suspects those interpretations, always contingent, that do not assume full responsibility. Somehow the epic task is one that assumes everything, takes everything on board, even though it can be absolutely, it might exceed absolutely the human capacity to achieve the goal. The epic frame keeps faithful to its principles, however ridiculous they may seem to the locals. They couldn't reach Santa Cruz de la Sierra because Che Guevara was around at the time, and so that there was military activity around, and they had to return to Chile. Here we have thoughts about very kind of typical of their way of looking at things is that they can learn from everything. In that sense, each place is equally plentiful to any other place in the earth. They sort of take from the modern idea of all facades being equal in importance, of kind of breaking up the Beaux-Artian or classical idea of front and back and hierarchies in terms of facades. They extend that idea to territory, and they say that each place, wherever you are, is equally significant. That also opens then the possibility of a school plan that it is based on direct observation, which then makes available to students every single kind of condition, however humble, as a possibility for learning. The second stage, they come back to Valparaiso. They are kind of beginning to form the school. They work as a kind of a cooperative. They bring their salaries together. They live in some kind of community in very humble ways. And at some point, they are offered a project in, this is Valparaiso. This is Viña del Mar. It's like a conurbation. This is more like a sea resort. This is more like a harbor. And they are offered a project for this area here, which is expanding as a kind of working class suburb. They are asked to produce a satellite town, but they say we should not produce a satellite town. We should establish a piece which somehow is emblematic of this relationship between the shore and the interior, but at the same time creating a new reference, a new urban reference that brings together this kind of peripheral condition in the same kind of status of relationship to the heart of, to the shore and to the heart of the city as any other place in the area. The kind of project is basically the construction of a kind of a boulevard. It is a straight line that crosses a site that follows the same kind of incline. It crosses through a tunnel and it reaches onto the shore. And on either side, there would be level terraces which could be built in any kind of way that was required. So that's at one level, this is much like Le Corbusier's kind of ideas for Rio. It is also based on the road as a generator of urban form. The road would be lined with trees all the way down, but the terraces would be left indeterminate. Those could be developed according to the wishes of the people, and they could receive somehow the contribution of numbers of different architects, so that it reads like a ramp surrounded by large steps. But obviously, is intended to acquire some kind of emblematic quality. By 1969, the government is planning to build an elevated highway connecting Valparaiso to Viña del Mar along this shore here. And the elevated highway will destroy the uses of the shore by people who live all around these areas here. Somehow it would have created complete kind of havoc. It was like a bridge. It reduces the underside to a dark, kind of damp and inaccessible place. So they decided to stop work at the school to join together with the students in the production of a proposition which was elaborated at high speed in order to present it to the government with the cost estimates, with the also technical kind of backup that might convince the government to change its own proposition by the idea of an avenue, which they call Avenida del Mar, which would integrate the shore, and it would this is, for example, a study of the layouts of the roads and the way of organizing the curves in relation to various speeds. They propose to create a system which consists of a series of strips. There's one for leisure, slow drive, there's one for fast drive, and so on. And the main point about it is that they want to keep and to activate the shore, which was already occupied by the locals. The project was not, it was presented in public exhibitions. They went to the press, they went to radios, they went to newspapers, they came to Santiago with the models, they looked for support, and they managed at least to prevent the worst damage that was to be done by the official government plan. This is another project. If Occupies was here, Avenida del Mar was here. This is a third linear project which consisted on unblocking this kind of stagnant water inlet, such as to create a kind of an inner harbor with the fishermen somehow lodged in these areas and with a series of developments inland. The projects didn't prosper. The third move is to purchase a stretch of land and to create a kind of an experimental ground for architecture, which they call the open city. There are a series of structures. Every kind of functional or poetic structure is submitted to a group, and it is somehow, it becomes like a proposition. For example, this was the water tower, and the works proceed one in relation to the other. Many of these works are authorless. There is someone who might construct a second phase to that project, and so on. But the point which links better with our kind of presentation and our preoccupation here is the idea of the crossings. At some point, they realize that if they want to be really serious about this business of taking care about the continental scale, they should organize the school curriculum in such a way that every year, every single student and every single tutor goes out onto some destination in South America, Chile, or abroad, in order to construct a project at the end of the trip. By now, they have made over 400 such outings. You have imagined that the whole place empties out, and there is obviously a tremendous kind of logistical problem behind that. They don't have a lot of money, and they approach the whole system of the voyage as a kind of pedagogic proposition. So here, for example, the design studios are involved in creating lighting systems, portable lighting systems, or maybe portable tents. And because they would do various experiences, designers will work on the basis of prototypes. This is the first one, there's a second one, and there is a third one, which becomes refined as they repeat the experience of the trip. The issue of lodging, cooking, heating, and so on becomes a proposition for the design school students and tutors. So that there is this kind of lightweight, nomadic kind of mode that becomes part of the way of life during the period of the travesía. But then there is a project which is built at the end of the trip, which has to be accomplished wherever place you go, with your means at hand. In this case, they probably transported the timber from Valparaiso, but they had to build the stonework from the local material. And this project would be either sculpture or would be an architectural piece. In this case, it is a sculpture which has been done with the contribution of an Argentinian sculptor, which is one of the tutors at school. This is an architectural project which consists of a system of stairways. We saw it in a previous image. Where each student is the designer of one of these stairs. There is an agenda, there is obviously a framework for it. The rules are very strict, but they have to design the stairs and build them, creating something like a summit over the summit of the hill, but at the same time, they create a promenade which also protects a kind of belvedere in the desert. This is a salt lake, Coipasa, high up above the sea. The conditions for construction are always very kind of difficult. They have to bring the staff upwards on their backs or by mule. And they have to figure out a way of building something which looks to them commensurate to the quality of the landscape. If you look at the projects, you find that there is always some kind of problem The problem is being dimensioned in a particular way. For example, this is a setting for tutors and students in the middle of this empty space. This is a floating project which was built in Titicaca, in the Peruvian lake, side of the Titicaca Lake, and which borrowed from the traditional kind of technology of building up rafts with local kind of material, which the uros, the inhabitants of the lake, used to use. This is something else near Buenos Aires. There is some kind of an earth construction. There is, in this case, in another setting, there is a hill sculpture, like something which is grafted on the hillside. There is an air element here, which is testing with the strength of the wind. We find the earth pieces here. There's a pathway on this area. There is this kind of sculpture on the side of the hill, and this comet here. And so they also go to explore the southern fjords. They do an extensive study of the area. It's an area of absolutely crazy kind of geography. It's almost non-inhabited. It's our kind of frontier, or 21st century frontier, in the sense that it is a wild, empty of human life, area. And they would build things which have some utility for maybe the first kind of families that might live around here, fishermen and so on. And eventually, they end up building a boat which becomes like a floating studio, which sets itself to explore this area and to organize studios during the period of crossings. This is Cape Forward. This is in southern Patagonia, looking onto Cape Horn. Is the southernmost reach of the continent. And the final thing which I want to show from that school, simply to show that the enterprise is in a way quite consistent, is the production of guidebooks for the exploration of the country. Federico Sanchez was an architect. He died a couple of years ago, and they devised this idea of the guidebook, which is also obviously an attempt to convey their ideas about the territory to the general public. And the interesting thing is that they persist on this pronouncement of the North as the South, and they actually publish the map of Chile upwards. And the public seemed to have accepted those in the first guidebooks, but the later ones assumed the convention. Sorry. I think in terms of fabricating, constructing the image of the country, the production of the guidebook is being something quite significant. It's probably the most significant thing they have accomplished. This was a limited edition, a first kind of trial, but then they got the support of a large company, and they actually produced the most important guidebook in Chile. They then went on to Argentina. They produced one there, and they were considering the production of another one for Bolivia, which did not materialize. And like with their early explorations, they support the thesis of reading. Obviously, when you have extremely linear country like Chile, the image of the country is always emphasizing that kind of north-south direction. They want to emphasize the east-west direction, simply to make it present that there was something happening in terms of the relationship between the continental basins. Very briefly, this is another architect who does an extensive study on the process of colonization of the Spaniards, the patterns of colonizations, and the way in which from one city issues an order to establish another settlement and so on, like a tree that expands gradually from the various kind of centers that are established in South America. His name is Borges, but I want to show it because he also embodies this idea of looking at the large scale and the small scale simultaneously. He's also trying to kind of frame and imagine a kind of continental view, and also he's interested in natural phenomena. There are many drawings of this kind that explore kind of things which are related to the effects of time, for example, on the foliage, the structure of plants, and so on. And maybe on a more conventional level, projects which somehow also try to relate to some kind of a metaphor, the condition of the large scale with the condition of the small scale. From Chile, a figure like Amancio Williams, particularly these images, which seems to be the most kind of evocative ones, to do with the installation of a large-scale artifact on the vast kind of plains, is also relevant to the topic of the architect operating or trying to imagine the large scale. There is obviously a megalomania kind of element in this, and it is probably quite good that the project was not implemented. But it is interesting that Amancio Williams requires at some point to decide on his own accord to spend his time and his energy in a vision which obviously exceeds in every possible way the scope of his possible kind of production or implementation. In the same way, I don't know much about Sergio Bernardes, but this idea of linking up the waterways in Brazil brings up also the issue of a distinction, or where do you establish the distinction between an architectural vision, a landscape vision, and a territorial vision, which begins to acquire kind of geopolitical or other kind of attributes which are not at all usual for our practices and our theoretical kind of equipment. I think it is useful to, when we think about Latin America, to think also what were our tools in order to imagine things. What are the kind of publications we read when we're thinking about these subjects? What is our kind of intellectual context? These are magazines, the English magazine, Architecture Review, which in a way brings about a sense of déjà vu, because they are, in 1950s, examining what happens when you introduce something of this scale into a landscape with those properties. This kind of image of absolute devastation, the change of scale, and the complete kind of uncertainty about the coexistence between these two conditions is part of, in a way, what we received at the time as a framework for the discussion about the territory. They look at the kind of lateral condition of the roads, maybe from the point of view of landscape, maybe it's all kind of very much framed in terms of visual experience. and it might be kind of not too comprehensive in its approach, but nevertheless, it is posing the problem about what to do or how to introduce these new elements into a given territory. And they look at the continentals as a source of experience and some successful experience in these terms. There is kind of nostalgic approach, obviously. But the case of Brasilia, which is also printed in the same issues of architectural review, is impressive in these terms. What happens when you describe something like that upon a territory? What is the difference within the kind of previous pattern of the area of Brasilia as compared to these counties in England? What are you somehow, what is the kind of an impact? What is the kind of effect of this large-scale project within this given territory? Very much within the spirit of the period, the question of graphics, motorway graphics and modes of perception becomes also a point of interest, and the idea that you can somehow design the graphics and improve onto the equipment of the motorway with the experience of the architect or the designer is something which is very much in the air. We have the infrastructure of the infrastructure, the petrol station as imagined by Amancio Williams, the petrol station project as commissioned by the Architectural Review to see how can you inscribe these facilities within the highway and how they might construct somehow an ambience which is positive and enhancing. But they also bring these projects, which are fantastic kind of unlikely projects to happen in a sense, which are also to do with the idea of movement and the fascination with the roads. The question about lighting, the question about equipment, and of course the Smithsons who begin to realize about the question of population dispersal, the importance of the motorway, and the inscription of the motorway within a given kind of piece of land, the relationships, the change, the new patterns, the new modes that emerge out of the presence of these high-speed systems. J.B. Jackson, then we have Peter Blake and Venturi, and so on. This is an ongoing discussion. I think this is part of what we're looking about. There has been some kind of theorizing about the business of the corridors, the kind of corridors that cover long territories, like as in the IIRSA project. And that, in my view, is also a background to our discussion. But then we have these kinds of conditions, which I think are quite important, like a road that works like an elongated square in Buenos Aires. The notion of the parkway as implemented in the largest Latin American city. The importance of roads in Caracas, this strange vision of a boulevard and a hill which is shaped like a pyramid. Finally, I just want to show a couple of things related to the terminus. I think that's the place of the destinies, the final place, the end of the route is the harbor. And we have large-scale processes of modeling of the seashores, as in Rio de Janeiro, with some fantastic kind of examples around the Guanabara Bay. We have this kind of utopian propositions very unlikely to be implemented by Paulo Mendes da Rocha in terms of recasting the harbor in Montevideo into a kind of a water square. We have Amancio Williams with his visions of the airports in the middle of the river, in front of the city. And we have the ecological reservation in Buenos Aires, which in a sense is an interesting kind of episode. It is the product of the construction of a highway. The debris of the highway is accumulated on the riverbed. The place is intended initially, I understand, for some kind of a satellite expansion of downtown Buenos Aires, but eventually becomes a ecological reservation, which seems to be quite successful in its present form. This was not designed. This resulted like so, somehow by accident. Thank you very much. That is what I want to present.
Well, Rodrigo, thank you very, very much for the presentation. I think that was fantastic. Of course, we've been running behind since the beginning, so what I'm going to suggest is that we actually move to the pit, and maybe you can answer questions informally at the pit. We have a reception for the launch of Harvard Design Magazine number 34, and maybe in a more sort of celebratory manner, we can continue over there, and tomorrow we will resume the sessions at 10 a.m. sharp.
Okay.